Thanks very much, Suzanne. That was a great presentation on what we need to do to try to get our athletes back to play safely, and very, very important. This last part of this first section, to me, is one of the most important talks that I do, and it's about trying to reduce risk. So this fella here is not a hockey player. His name's U.B. Blake, and he was an American jazz pianist who lived to be either 92 or 98, I think, depending on who you believe. But his famous quote was, "If I'd known I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of myself." So this is about taking better care of our athletes, this last section, if we can. And it's called reducing the risk. We call it prevention. You know what? It may be pretty difficult to absolutely prevent concussion. We're not ever going to get rid of it completely when we're playing contact and collision sport. However, there are a lot of things we can do to try to reduce the risk of it occurring, and that's what we're going to speak about now. The first thing we think about when we think about trying to protect against concussion is we think of protective equipment. And this is just a sampling of the various helmets that we have in our house for various sports. Helmets are important, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Pat Bishop, who will be speaking to us this afternoon, is an expert in this field, and I'm just going to touch on some of these concepts, but we're going to be hearing more. Now, helmets are so important. This is a church in Siena, Italy that I was in, where they have a shrine that people who've been involved in motor vehicle accidents and scooter accidents have put their helmets up there as offerings to St. Agnes because of being delivered from injury. And with all due respect to St. Agnes, I think it was their helmet that probably delivered them from injury. But this is sort of underscores the importance of protective equipment. Now, the hockey helmet has come a long way. This is an early prototype that you can see here back in the early days. And then it developed up to the sort of the forehead protector that we saw in the 50s. This is a great shot because for those of you who are young and don't remember maskless goalies and most players not wearing helmets, it's amazing how far we've come to today's more modern helmets. But there's a few things we need to know about helmets that are important. And the first thing is that, well, helmets offer hope. We have to understand what exactly helmets do and what they don't do. This says, how many times have I told you to wear your helmet? Clearly it wasn't going to help him very much here. Helmets were designed to reduce the risk of skull fracture and laceration about the scalp. They weren't really designed to prevent concussion, nor can they, because as we talked about, concussion can occur from rotational stresses to the brain too. So unless you had the helmet bolted onto the shoulder pads, you're not going to be absolutely able to prevent concussion. But obviously it does reduce the blow to the head, and so that's important. The helmet's got to stay on for it to be able to do that. So doing your helmet up is appropriate, and there's many people in the NHL who need to remember the one-finger rule underneath the chin strap. You shouldn't be able to take your helmet off the ice and put it on your head like this, as they do so many times in the NHL, if it's a proper fitting and properly worn helmet. The helmet has to be in good shape. So if a helmet is cracked, then it's not going to provide the protection. And you can see the CSA sticker on there, which is the certification that helmets need to have in Canada. And that helmet, this was my son's helmet that I discovered that right before a game, much to my consternation, which involved a quick trip to the store to try and find a new helmet, which is interesting because when you get a helmet, if you go to get bindings for your skis, you have to go to people who are certified to fit skis and to adjust bindings so that you don't get an ACL tear. But you can go to any store and get somebody to put a helmet on you with no qualification whatsoever, and that's protecting your brain. So I've always thought that's kind of curious that we don't have a little bit more training for people in sports stores or Canadian Tires to be able to fit helmets a little bit better. Now, inside helmets, you have liners, and liners can be of various types, and I don't believe that there's really any difference between the liners in terms of the protection. But an interesting thing that I learned is that clearly if that liner is damaged, just like the helmet being damaged, it's not going to protect you. But the interesting thing is that with time, sweat, especially if there's any perfume in it from, say, hair gels, mousse, anything like that, will break these down. And even though they'll look normal, in fact, they won't be as protective as they once were, which means that helmets may well need to be changed more frequently than once thought. And I know NHL teams change their home helmets, or at least they get new liners for them, it's possible, every year, and their road helmets every 6 months because of travel and cold and drying issues. So it may be that if you're child is a competitive hockey player and they're on the ice 5 times a week, that having that 3 or 4-year-old helmet just isn't adequate anymore in terms of protection. Facial protection, obviously, and I bring this up especially when we're here as one of the organizers is the Pashby Fund, and Dr. Pashby did so much for hockey and has eliminated the eye injury in hockey with this piece of equipment. And the question then becomes, well, does it do anything in terms of concussion? Well, there was a good study done that shows, number one, it doesn't increase the risk. There's always a concern when you add something on, does it change anything? Does it make it heavier? And the answer is no. And in fact, the group that wore a full face versus a half visor, well, the concussion, the amount of concussion was basically the same. The severity seemed to be less in those who wore full facial protection. It makes sense if you get hit to the face or to the jaw that some of that force will be absorbed by the shield. The key thing for kids when they're playing is to make sure that they have these J-clips on. Many times they're fiddly and the parents won't put them on. And if those aren't there, basically those prevent the shield from going up. If you take those off, then you lose that effect. So if you're a minor hockey trainer or parent, you make sure that those are installed properly. Mouth guards are a source of controversy. Again, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Piccinini here who will be talking about this in much more detail. There's many different kinds of mouth guards, from simple $5.95 stock mouth guards to custom fitted dental mouth guards, and the one on the top left, which is an upper and lower mouth guard, which is the most uncomfortable thing I've ever worn, I must say. Do mouth guards help prevent concussions? Well, I won't steal Dr. Piccinini's presentation, but the bottom line is there's a lot of misconceptions about mouth guards. But from a concussion point of view, there's never been a definitive study to show that they absolutely do reduce concussion risk. From a dental and oral injury risk, absolutely, and they should be worn for that reason. The problem with equipment, though, is something in injury prevention we talk about, something called risk compensation. The problem is when you put kids in equipment, they feel like this. And if you feel like this and you're a teenager, you're pretty invincible on 2 counts, right? I'm a teenager, so nobody can get me, I'm going to live forever, and I've got all this equipment on. So that can encourage a playing style that may be dangerous because they're just not worried about getting hurt. And so we have to be careful as we add equipment that we take into account this risk compensation. The other thing we have to take into account is, well, this elbow pad is really good at preventing elbow injuries. It's very hard, and when it contacts another player's head, it actually increases the risk of concussion to that player. So when I used to play when I was a little kid, we had very soft elbow pads, and I mean, you'd still feel it if you hit anybody. If you don't feel it now, then again, that may be another form of risk compensation. Now we're going to get off equipment and get on to some other topics that are, I think, extremely important, one of which is education. And by education, that's what we're doing here today. So one of the most important things in terms of helping to reduce the risk of concussion is having knowledgeable people, and that's why we've been doing these. We've spoken from Whitehorse to St. John's across the country trying to get the word out. Lately, it's great. It seems to be the media is picking up on this, so the word is getting out there. But education about what concussion is, how to manage it, how to approach it properly is key. It's also important to educate people who play the game. Now, at Think First, we've developed in the past 2 videos on playing smart hockey, and we have another one in production right now that will be out sometime soon. And the idea behind this is to teach about concussion, but also teach how to play the game to reduce your risk, to not be 3 feet from the boards going in head first. How to play the game, in a smart way. Will physical preparation make a difference? Again, there's no studies on this, and we don't have any specific conditioning exercises that are going to be particularly helpful that we've proven. This is my high-tech video. There it is. That's to signify a bobblehead. I used to have an Eric Lindros bobblehead, but I thought, given the poor problems Eric had had, I took that off because I thought that was just, after all the concussion problems he'd had. This shows that, especially in kids with a heavy head, when you get hit, of course, your head can whip around, and that can certainly, as we've talked about, increase your risk of concussion. And so, while there's no proof, it just makes sense that exercises to try to strengthen the neck may be helpful from that standpoint. And particularly in soccer, and particularly for heading the ball, it's important to have a strong neck. So physical preparation can be helpful. But I think the key thing, and the thing that's been in the news, is with respect to how the game is played, and playing the game with respect and playing the game fairly. Because that's where a lot of our issues come. You can be prepared, you can be knowledgeable about concussion, but if somebody is going to run you and hit you in the head, there's not much you can do to prevent that. And so we see that. I mean, we see this, unfortunately, you know, kids model after the NHL, and we see the head hits in the NHL. Now they're grappling with this, and it's not as easy as people might think to just say no more head hits. There's some things that need to be done to sort that out, but at least it's good they're starting to talk about this, but they need to do more and they need to get going on this, because like it or not, the NHL is a role model for kids, and if they don't deal with it at that level, then it's not going to filter down. Even in our game in sledge hockey, we see hits to the head, so it's the same, and we'll see it in women's hockey. It's not just in the pro game. So we have rules, and we certainly have rules in minor hockey. This says yelling at the refs will help your team win, because they really like that. It's amazing how, and I've seen this as a coach and a parent, you have rules, that hit to the head, 5 in a game. In minor hockey, out you go. And that's great as long as it's somebody else's kid or a player on the other team. As soon as the call is made on your kid or on a player on your team, suddenly it's a bad rule, or he didn't hit him in the head, or it was accidental. So if we have a rule, we have to support it, and we have to support it whether it's our kid or our team. We have to support the refs, because if the refs are intimidated, they may not call that rule. Don't embarrass me. Well, parents, we have to talk the talk, we have to walk the walk too. We have to support safe play. And for the whatever percent who will make a living in hockey, the other 99 whatever percent are playing the game for fun. And when you ask kids why they play the game, they'll list fun always number 1. In fact, probably number 2 and number 3. They're not playing to get to the NHL, really, when you ask them about it, because they know that realistically they're not going to get there, and the odds are against them. They're playing for fun. They're not playing to live out, dad's fantasy of making the NHL, but they're playing for fun. And we have to always remember that, and we have to put rules in place that support safe play. Now, we've talked a lot about hockey. There are injuries in other sports that we'll just briefly go through. Soccer, we've touched on. Now, people think about concussion in soccer, they think about heading the ball, and the studies have been kind of conflicting in terms of whether heading is associated with an increased risk of concussion. There's one interesting one that came out of Norway where they compared ex-Norwegian soccer players to track and swimming athletes, and they did cognitive tests on them down the way, and because the soccer players didn't do as well, they said, well, there you go, heading the ball. Well, of course, there's a lot of confounders there that we need to look at. Interestingly, the soccer players probably drank about 4 times as much as the others, and so that alone may have made a difference. But we don't have the definitive study. But what we do know is that going up for the header is where the contact occurs in soccer. And unlike hockey, where goalie statistically is the safest position from an injury point of view for concussion, being the keeper in soccer is the most dangerous because there's the most contact. And interestingly, out of that came the development of Headgear. And one of our speakers sitting next to me, Dr. Delaney, is very knowledgeable, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I remember he wrote an editorial years ago about Headgear in soccer, and I thought, nah, that'll never fly. Shows how much I know, because it flew, and people are now starting to use them. And some studies are showing that it can reduce the risk of impact to the head, and does not really impact on how the game's played. It doesn't impact on appropriate heading. Risk compensation, though, you can't, if you're going to head the ball, you still have to head the ball properly. Just because you have this headgear on doesn't mean you can start heading the ball inappropriately, because that'll increase your risk of injury. No question that helmets in cycling have made a huge difference and have saved a lot of brains. The idea of legislating helmets is controversial, but there's no question that helmets have saved a lot of brains. Really well taken up in snowboarding, I found. It's the unusual snowboarder who doesn't wear a helmet. Skiing, it's starting to be taken up. It's something that we need to look at, get more data on, but there's no question that ski helmets are likely to save a lot of brains as well. So just since I'm the last speaker in this particular section, just some key points to remember from presentations that Dr. Leclerc and I have done, some take-home points. Remember, for the 59th time, but it's important, you don't have to lose consciousness to have had a concussion. You never, ever, ever return to play while symptomatic. If you suspect a concussion, you should come out of the game or practice and be managed appropriately. You need to rest to get better. This is a different injury than your athletes have ever had. You don't suck it up and play through a concussion. If you suck it up and try to play through a concussion, you will get worse, not better. And we have to convince them of that this is different than other injuries. But the hardest thing for anybody, including an athlete, to do is rest. So it's tough treatment. The return to play should always follow a stepwise progression. We don't have a test to know when the brain is healed. We have to challenge it bit by bit, as Dr. Leclerc has presented. When in doubt, sit them out. So if you're concerned as an athlete, if you're concerned as a coach that they may not be better, then err on the side of caution, especially in kids, and don't let them play until you're sure. Prevention, I say I should have taken this out because I guess I don't like that word, but reducing the risk. We want to try to do everything we can to reduce the risk of this injury so that our athletes can play the game safely. And we have to convince people that by doing this, we're not trying to change the nature of the game. We're just trying to allow people to play great games in a more safe way. And Think First has a website which has a lot of information on it that you can access as well that sort of reiterates all the things we've talked about today. This says, okay, Mr. Ditmars, remember that brain is only a temporary, so don't think too hard with it. Unfortunately, we do not have the luxury of getting a second brain when the first one is damaged, so it's important to remember all this stuff. Thank you very much.